Hello, I am Andrea Koch, a former Bright Memorial Library, member of the Board of Trustees, and school librarian. Our wonderful friends of the library have asked me to review the book, This Tender Land by William Kent Krueger for this month's Book Sandwiched In program. Many thanks to our friends for the opportunity to talk about this beautiful book. And I also wanted to thank my own book club, Bells. We call ourselves that at the Friday Evening Literary Society. And for over 20 years, we've been talking about books. And I thank them for their insight as I was preparing for today. I highly recommend surrounding yourself with others who love books and stories and learning. It is really a gift. These are my own reflections and thoughts about this book. I do wish I had the opportunity to have a conversation directly with you. There's so much to take from this novel, from history to the trials and tribulations of human existence, growing up, and making sense out of our lives. I think we could talk for hours, but don't worry, I won't talk for hours. I picked a few themes that resonated with me to share. And I won't give away any of the mysteries of the book in case you haven't read it yet, but I hope after listening today that you will read it. I will talk a little about the author and his process, some issues I thought that were relevant to my role as a librarian, as well as some history and themes of place, music, a spiritual journey, and coming of age. This Tender Land's journey begins in Lincoln, Minnesota, in the summer of 1932, on the banks of the Gilead River. The Lincoln Indian Training School is a horrible place, more of a prison than a school, where Native American children are forcibly separated from their families. They are sent there to be educated. It's a home to our protagonist, Odie O'Banion, an orphan boy who is a bit of a rascal. And he earns the wrath of the school superintendent. They all call her the Black Witch. Odie, who is 12 years old, and his brother Albert, who's 16, are the only white children among the hundreds of Native American children at the school. They end up at the school because their mother died and their moonshine maker father had been shot. After a horrible incident in which Odie commits a crime, Odie and Albert are forced to flee for their lives. They are joined by their best friend Mose, a mute boy of Dakota Sioux heritage, and a heartbroken little girl named Emmy. Together, our four voyagers head down the Gilead River in a canoe to the Minnesota River and then the Mississippi River, and finally to St. Louis, Missouri, and the promise of family and home. Albert, Odie, Mose, and Emmy travel the countryside discovering the good and bad hidden truths of people. Their adventures are a showcase of Depression-era society, including a deranged farmer who captures them and makes them work for him, a traveling spiritual revival show, hobos on the railway, and one of the many Hoovervilles scattered across the country. Theirs is a journey into the unknown world of beauty, as well as meanness, crossing paths with others who are adrift, searching for a future, a home, and family, and a place to belong, and emerging on the other side, still full of hope. I was happy to be asked to review this book. It's just the kind of book that I love to read for a number of reasons. There is a compelling cast of characters. They are very human, very imperfect, with good hearts, but so much to learn. Yet they remain hopeful even in the direst of circumstances. They are children, and this is a coming-of-age novel. The author spent some time researching child development at the University of Minnesota earlier in his life, so I wonder whether this led to an interest in writing this kind of story. Although I'll speak more later about where the original spark for this novel came from. Another thing I love about this novel is the beautiful natural setting. I found myself Googling some of the images of locations in the book to help me visualize their journey. I think especially in the time of the COVID pandemic, I enjoyed being able to get out of my house on a trek through the wilderness with these interesting characters. Something a great book can do for you while still staying safe at home. I love the journey. They're being physically tested by the harshness of nature, their trials, and their personal growth. I love historical fiction because, along with a great story, it teaches you about the world and gives you a window into a historical time and people's lives within it. So the Depression era, but also Native American history in this book. Books have a power to transport us to different worlds and times and hear the voice of another person, building our empathy and our understanding. I also love the music in this book. My father played the harmonica like Odie. And because I am not a musician myself, I love when a great book helps me connect to the beauty and depth of feeling of musicians and their music. One of my favorite aspects of this Tenderland, though, is that Odie is a storyteller. As a school librarian, I can relate to the storyteller and the power of a good story told. Even today, in this time with so much technology, our children are still so drawn in and engaged by the powerful words of a good story. Such a joy as a librarian to share stories with others. The author, William Kent Krueger, said, "What makes those of us who are storytellers storytellers is the ability to sink ourselves deeply into the imagining of an experience we ourselves have not had. We find the words to create it that feel very real, very honest, and very true to readers." The author makes his protagonist, Odie, a born storyteller, even at his young age. And throughout the book, he tells Albert, Emmy, and Mose tales about an imp, a princess, and the vagabonds on a journey, their journey. The book is set up at the beginning with Odie as an old man, looking back and narrating the events of that summer from his perspective at the end of a long life, as truthfully as he can, with compassion and tenderness for his young self and his companions. Old Odie's great-grandchildren ask him to tell them a story, and he says, "I need no goading. Stories are the sweet fruit of my existence, and I share them gladly." This is from page 1. And so right away, I knew that I would love this book, as stories are the sweet fruit of my existence as well. It is amazing to see the power of stories, the ability of a story to hold even the rapt attention of the most squiggly child. And it is just the heart and soul of my job to be the conveyor of a good story and a great author's words. So powerful. So old Odie at the beginning sets up the action of the story through these words. "The tale I am going to tell is of a summer long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal, and of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about?" Despite all that these children go through, they still have hope. And we adults can learn a lot from children in that way, in many ways. So there are so many things to love about this story. A little about the author. His name is William Kent Krueger. He's also the author of the long-running Cork O'Connor mystery series. There are now 18 books in that series. His novel, Ordinary Grace, won the Edgar Award for the best novel. And this, along with This Tenderland, are two of his best-selling standalone novels. His books feature the wildlands of northern Minnesota, which we'll talk a little bit more about, an assortment of characters and always interesting plots. Perhaps This Tenderland is so popular now because in ways it does speak to our times. There are parallels between the difficult times of the Depression and now with homelessness, unemployment, economic disparity, loss, and a search for greater spirituality, something greater than ourselves. Like his character Odie, William Kent Krueger is a storyteller. He grew up on stories and stories his family told of living during the Depression. He did extensive research at the Minnesota History Center and its Gale Family Library library, including reading newspapers published in Minnesota during the time, and many memoirs of people living during that time, including those who went to the Indian schools, like the central characters do. He researched fashions, the costs of things, the language that they used at the time, events that the kids would have known about, and more. And of course, as a librarian, I love this about the author. He didn't want to weigh the story down, though, with historical facts, but what he did include, he wanted to make sure was accurate, and he wanted to correctly set the story in time and place. Even the music was well researched. I thought I would share with you a little bit that I found on his website of the things that inspired him. Just a second, and I'll get to it. So these are some of the images that he found at the Historical Society when he went there that he used to inspire his story. So this is a picture of the Pipestone Indian Training School, which is part of the inspiration for the Lincoln Indian Training School. This is one of the many Hoovervilles during the Depression era. This is an image of a family farm that was foreclosed on. Just amazing images of the dust storms that took place. That was from 1936. This is a great image of a 1920s tent revival meeting, not unlike that of Sister Eve's Sword of Gideon Healing Crusade. This is interesting. This is a monument that they made to the event in the book that impacts Mose so much, about the largest mass hanging in American history, and we'll talk more about that. This marker was there for many years, but has disappeared, and they don't know where it is. But there is a new monument there to honor those who were murdered or who were hanged during that time. This is an image of the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi River. This is Fort Snelling. This is south of Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the two rivers come together. So I think it looks very different now, but this would have been what it would have looked like during their time. And a picture in the area of the West Side Flats of St. Paul, where they spent some time in the book. So you can look at these a little bit more, these great images on the author's website. Those are some of the things that he found in his research that inspired him. I do think that some of the historic events in the book really could have been, in my perspective, fleshed out a little bit more. It left me a bit confused, as I am sure it would others who didn't have that background knowledge. But hopefully the book will encourage readers to do some research and additional reading. Moses' character as a Native American boy was beautiful, but I do wish I could have known him better as well. One key theme is the Native American experience during the time, and the author has Native characters in all of his books. He does work with the local Native community and has Native friends, and he does try to respect and honor their perspectives and their history. As a librarian and a teacher, and an important issue this book brings to mind is the concern about cultural appropriation. This is the adoption of elements of a minority culture by members of the dominant culture. It is distinguished from equal cultural exchange due to the presence of the colonial element, an imbalance of power. William Kent Krueger is white, and one of the main characters, Mose, is Native American, and several of the important historical events highlighted revolve around Native American history. The issue with cultural appropriation in literature, as well as other forms of art and culture, is when one culture, the dominant one, uses things that belong to a minority culture, and that minority culture can feel offended or a sense of loss or injustice. So I really do appreciate the fact that the author worked hard to research and work directly with members of the Native community to make sure he got the history and characters right and honored and respected their culture. William Kent Krueger acknowledges he's a white guy trespassing, but this doesn't change the fact that the story is told by a white author through the recollections of his central white protagonist. I would highly recommend extending your knowledge of the Indian schools and other Native American history and perspectives by Native American authors. We refer to these kinds of books as own voices books, books about diverse characters that have been written by authors from that same diverse group. The Own Voices movement is seeking out more diverse perspectives and voices in literature and to honor stories about characters from groups that have previously been marginalized. These groups include ethnic minorities, but also different sexual orientations and identities, and those with disabilities. Our central Native American character, Mose, is mute, a symbol of Native Americans being voiceless. So that voice that the author does give him is very important. Actually, most of the Native children in the story do not speak. Mose learns American Sign Language, and I do love how the author describes the beauty of Moses signing and integrates it into the story. I would love to hear from deaf readers regarding how accurately the author portrays and honors their language in this book. I was surprised to learn that there are people who do not know the history of the off-reservation Indian schools in America and Canada. The goal of those schools was to strip away the Native culture and language from the children and make them really white people, total assimilation, to get rid of their Native culture. The children were not permitted to speak their own Native languages, tell their stories, celebrate their traditions, and more. The tenet was to kill the Indian and save the man. But the children were also free and inexpensive labor to farmers, and they were domestic help, which we saw depicted in the book. Native families had no say and had to give up their children to these schools. Even the smallest children were taken from their families, and many died at the schools, never to return. They actually existed from the 1860s up until the late 1970s. Wow, I was shocked when I learned that through my own research. The real Pipestone School that I showed you in that picture, that's the inspiration of the school. They actually used reservation land to build the school. That was an additional injury to the Native community because it took them over 25 years to get compensated for that land that was taken from them. In my research for this presentation, I found that there are still a few of these off-reservation boarding schools that are still active, although Native American families now choose to send their children. I found one of the schools still active that's very near where I grew up in California, and it's been in existence since 1892. It's called the Sherman Indian High School in Riverside, California. I went to Serrano Junior High School in San Bernardino County, and it is named for the nearby Serrano tribe. Tribe members were my classmates and my friends, and when I looked at the rosters of the Sherman School, I saw names of children from the Serrano tribe way back to the late 1800s. So it really hit home for me. There's a cemetery at that school, and so when children at the school died, their remains were not sent home to their families. Now the schools do learn about and celebrate their languages, their cultures, history, and traditions. I hope to be able to visit the museum there next time I'm in California. The author wanted to share a sense of the horror of the Indian boarding schools without overwhelming the reader, because there were many horrible things that happened to these children, and many of them didn't make it. The one event I knew little about while reading the book is the event Mose discovers, which becomes a turning point for him. When he begins to understand who he is and where he comes from, the event is the largest mass execution in American history. The Us Dakota War of 1862 erupted in southwest Minnesota when treaties restricted the lands of the Dakota people to an area that could no longer sustain them. Promised compensations were slow or non-existent, and the Dakota people feared starvation, heading into a brutal Minnesota winter. So skirmishes led to the declaration of war, which lasted 37 days. There were 392 prisoners that were quickly tried by a military commission, and 303 of them were sentenced to death for war crimes. President Lincoln approved 39 executions, though one was later suspended. On December 26, 1882, these 38 men were simultaneously hung in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in American history. Most of the Dakota did not speak English, did not know they were being tried for crimes, and most did not have counsel defending them. After the execution, 2 were found to have been hanged mistakenly, including a young white man who was adopted and raised by the Dakotas. In the years since the convictions, historians question whether a military commission was legitimate in cases where central charges were murder, rape, and robbery. Additionally, the military commission was made up of those who had fought in the war, hardly unbiased judges handing out convictions. Angelique Eaglewoman, a Dakota professor of law from the University of Idaho College of Law, criticized the actions of Lincoln. She said, "I think he should have followed general military practice at the time. They should have been released. Lincoln made a political decision, but he made the decision based on racial hatred of the time. And Lincoln was a lawyer and he knew that it was improper." In addition to the 38 men hanged, there were injustices committed against hundreds of others in the form of military convictions and inhumane injustices to the more than 3,000 Dakota people who were held captive and then forcibly marched west out of Minnesota. I am no expert though, so I encourage you to learn more about this and other events in Native American history. Knowing this history through some background research did help me to understand Moses' torment when he learns of this event involving his tribe. This tender land also focuses deeply on place, a place the author loves, the Midwest. The heartland really speaks to him. He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the setting of Lincoln, Minnesota is a fictitious town, but it's based on the real city of Pipestone. Like the deep historical research he did, the author also went to the places in the book. The Gilead River is a fictional river. Embarrassingly, I learned this because I tried very hard to research the Gilead River in Minnesota, and I just couldn't find it. It is a tributary to the real Minnesota River, which connects to the Mississippi and then flows, which then flows 1,500 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. William Kent Krueger kayaked a section of the Minnesota River that the kids were on in the story. He canoed the Mississippi, that section of that the kids were on in the story, and it says it was quite harrowing and feared for his life at one point. He walked the places within the towns and cities and walked the West Side Flats in St. Paul. Of course, it's very different now, but he imagined his characters there at the time. And he also went to the former site of the Indian school that inspired the setting of the story. I really love maps, and I wanted to learn where these rivers were and kind of what it looked like to help visualize the book. And so I thought I would share a couple things with you that I found. This was the map that is on the website. of their trip. But really, St. Louis being down here at the bottom and Lincoln, Minnesota. But this map really just confused me. And I tried to compare it to a real map and just really got nowhere. Maybe somebody can explain it to me. But I did look at some real maps. So this is Minnesota, and this right here, this big one here, is the Minnesota River. And I think one of the things that threw me is the Minnesota River goes kind of, southeast, and then at Mankato, it actually goes northeast until it reaches the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, where it then flows into the Mississippi River. So I think that really helped me to kind of picture that. And this is just a little blow up of part of the Minnesota River, and you can see that it really winds and turns quite a bit. And I think it's probably just a very beautiful place. So up here is Minneapolis, where the Minnesota River comes into, and then you can see just the length of this and how far, over 500 miles it takes to get to St. Louis along the river from Minneapolis. So I hope that helped you visualize it a little bit. It helped me, and I do love maps, and I do like to know where I am. So after he did all of this research and went to all of these places, he just turns the story over to his imagination, and then can find the words of his characters. This Tenderland has been described as the adventures of Huckleberry Finn meets the Odyssey. William Kent Krueger first got the idea for this book when he was just 11 years old, when his 5th grade teacher read the class The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And then he also just had to read Huck Finn. And then he wanted to go on all those adventures with them. I wanted to share this fun little story that I heard of an event in the author's childhood. So the summer after he read these Mark Twain books and inspired by Mark Twain, he decided that he, his older brother, and his 2 neighbors should set sail on Riley Creek, which ran through his family's property where he lived in Ohio at the time. Riley Creek was 10 feet wide and about 2.5 feet deep. He says, "We spent days scavenging wood, nailing it together, lashing it together. We put it in the creek, then drew straws to see who would test the stability. My older brother drew the long straw. He stepped onto the raft and it immediately sank. He got all muddy, and that ended the expedition." But it was the beginning of a journey that eventually brought the author to the writing of this Tenderland. So I'm happy that he went on that little adventure. So it is an homage to these books and to Mark Twain, a uniquely American kind of journey. In the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck is an outcast. He also travels the Mississippi River in a canoe with Jim, his older Black friend, and along the way, Huck and Jim meet all kinds of characters and experience mishaps and adventures, not unlike our travelers. And that exposes them to the best and the worst of humanity. Like our friends who learn about Moe's and Native American history and racism, Huck learns about the world and begins to understand its racist outlook. Odie is also named for Odysseus, the hero of Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, with similar themes of cunning, a clever mind over physical prowess, the pitfalls of temptation, divine justice, and the great triumph of arriving home at the end of the journey. But in this case, there's a group of people on the journey. They are their own kind of family, and if they hold together as a family, their journey will certainly take them home. Odie's connection to music is also an important theme in this Tenderland. The author is not a musician, but he loves music and its ability to lift spirits and even make you cry as a baby. And as I'm sure you and I can relate to. He says, in that way, music is very like a good story. For Odie, music is solace, it's inspiration, it helps connect our travelers to people along the way, and it comforts and helps them, kind of like a prayer. Many of the songs included were ones the author listened to growing up. I am also not a musician, but certainly enjoy music, and I love literature that can help me experience that deep personal connection and beauty of music through the characters. Whisker was the piano player when they went to the sort of Gilead tent revival group, and he was a piano player and an African American, and he took Odie under his wing. This I just wanted to read a little bit to you. Is Odie speaking about him from page 206. He taught me, so Whisker taught me about music in a way that Miss Stratton never had time for. I knew how to read sheet music, but I'd never been a part of a larger body of musicians. Whisker worked with me on timing and listening to other instruments and feeling what he called the noble bubble, by which he meant that moment when all the notes of each musician slid effortlessly around and among one another, so that a piece of music became such a beautiful sound that it captured the spirits of both player and listener and carried them effortlessly upward, like a bubble. It doesn't always happen, Buck, Whisper said, but when it does, feels like God's lifting you up in the palm of his hand. I just love that. And if you want to hear some of the music, there's actually a list on Spotify. It's called Music Inspired by This Tender Land. So I highly suggest you take a look at that. There is a link on the author's website, but you can just go to Spotify and take a look at and listen to some of the great music in the story. So spirituality, but not really religion, is another important theme of this book. All of our characters are on a spiritual journey, as we all are. When I was around Odie's age myself, I was on my own spiritual journey, looking for answers to the big questions of God, life, death, and how to save myself and my family when the inevitable end of the world would come. So in a small way, I can connect to young Odie's search for understanding, his doubts, his fear, his anger, and love. Odie is trying to come to terms with God, that tornado God who destroyed so much the good in Odie's life, all the adults who loved and cared for him, and maybe even his big brother. He is angry with this evil God and wonders, is there a just and compassionate God? The four children on this journey were grieving. Old Odie says, "We were afraid and grieving, but that was only part of it. There is a deeper hurt than anything sustained by the body, and it's the wounding of the soul. It's the feeling that you've been abandoned by everyone, even God. It's the most alone you'll ever be. A wounded body heals itself, but there is a scar, and I thought the same must be true for a soul." There is also the God in nature, as shared by the one-eyed pig-scared Jack on page 151. So I'm going to share just a little bit of his philosophy of God. And he calls Odie Buck, as Whisper does too. "Everything's hard work, Buck. You don't wrap your thinking around that. Life will kill you for sure. Me, I love this land, the work. Never was a churchgoer. God all penned up under a roof? I don't think so. Ask me. God's right here, in the dirt, in the rain, the sky, the trees, the apples, the stars, in the cottonwoods. In you and me too. It's all connected, and it's all God. Sure, this is hard work, but it's good work, because it's a part of what connects us to this land, Buck, this beautiful, tender land." Of course, the children's terrible experience with the tornado makes Odie highly doubt this God in nature. Then our adventurers also meet this group of faith healers running a con job crusade. But the group's leader, Sister Eve, truly has the gift of healing, which she shares with Odie. There was a huge tent revival movement in our country, places where Christians would gather to hear religious leaders speak. These were common during the Great Depression, often traveling the country from town to town. They offered hope to people in desperate times. I see parallels to our own difficult times of people looking for hope through spirituality, through religion, and many taken in by charlatans, as they were at the time, doing and justifying terrible things in the name of God. There is Odie's tornado God versus that graceful and loving spirituality of Sister Eve. Odie is so attracted to the love and spirit of Eve, and she's also kind of a mother figure that Odie is searching for so desperately. Eve tells Odie the only prayer she knows will be answered is the prayer asking for forgiveness. There is so much needed in this story, forgiving yourself as well as others, family, difficult and even evil people, and maybe even forgiveness of God. I love that the author made Eve's character one who was really spiritual and not just a charlatan, as so many of these faith healers are in books and movies and probably were in real life. I also love that Emmy, little Emmy, is a seer and that there is a bit of magic in this book. I think maybe some readers might not like the magic or the several crazy coincidences that happen in this story, but I often enjoy a little magic, good luck, and certainly some happy endings. The author says that, like Emmy, his mother was a visionary, so I do wish I knew a little bit more about that and its connection to this book. The author says, I have pretty much dealt with the spiritual aspects and traditions of the native cultures here in Minnesota from the get-go. You can't talk about a people unless you speak about their spiritual beliefs, about their relationship to each other and to all of creation, the great mystery. A lot of this book to think about and be inspired by. So as a coming-of-age novel, the difficult journey of these children leads to profound growth. Odie doesn't remain a rogue and a rascal. Instead, he matures into a young man that's forever altered by that summer and the adventures they were on. Odie says, if you kill a man, you are changed forever. If that man comes back to life, you are transformed. I have witnessed this and other miracles with mine own eyes. So among the many pieces of wisdom life has offered me over all these years is this. Open yourself to every possibility, for there is nothing your heart can imagine that is not so. Odie feels deeply, loving and hating in equal measure as the situation demands. He takes what he learns and is a better person because of his journey, regardless of the hardship that it caused. In this tender land, we find human beings in the worst situation they could find themselves in. Great privation and loss, yet they respond to the needs of others. They rise to great generosity and compassion. Humanity and love and kindness and resilience of so many is evident in this book. As one reviewer said, love is what makes a tender land. People and nature, not perfect, but full of what binds us all together. Old Odie says on page 4, the tale I'm going to tell is a summer of long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal. And of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about? This is a novel of hope, the human response to great difficulty. People who have very little find the grace and selflessness to share what they have with those who have even less. Those who open their hearts make all the difference. And I think this is such an important message for our times. And a heartfelt letter to readers you can find on his website. William Kent Krueger says, "In asking you to read this tender land, I am, in a way, offering you my heart. I've poured the best of myself into this story. If you haven't read it, I hope that you do." As a librarian, I'd like to suggest a few other books you might want to read, but please also talk to your wonderful Bright Memorial Library librarians for more suggestions. Where the Crawdads Sing, a wildly popular, and I think included in this book sandwiched in series in the past. It's also a beautiful and tragic coming-of-age novel set in nature. Ordinary Grace, the other standalone novel by William Kent Krueger. I recommend some more reading about the Indian schools. I first read a children's book, Fatty Legs, by Margaret Pokiak Fenton, a young person's memoir about going to an Indian boarding school. That was my first deeper understanding of the life at those Indian schools. The story of Jim Thorpe, a Native American and one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, who was forced to go to an Indian boarding school. The Native American author Joseph Bruchac has written several books about Jim Thorpe and many other books for young people and adults about Native American history and culture. Anything by Louise Erdrich, but one of my favorites is The Roundhouse. And if you're looking for another coming-of-age novel, This Boy's Life by Tobias Wolff. Thank you for watching and happy reading.